So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Arlis Cataloguing Workshop and Introduction to Cataloguing. My name is Yamina Room and the co-chair of the Arlis Cataloguing and Classification Committee. And today's event is hosted and organised by us as part of a series of Arlis online workshops. So do keep your eye out for additional sessions. There'll be more coming in the next few months. I'd also just like to say thank you to everyone on the committee for their help with organising these events as well. So before we get started, I'll just mention a few housekeeping things. So as you know, we'll be recording this session to make it more widely available. So it would be great if you could keep your sound and video off, and we should have muted everyone as they came in to make that easier. After Victoria's presentation, there'll be time to ask questions. So you can either make a note of any questions and ask those at the end yourself, or if you'd like, please do put those in the chat box and I'll mention the name of the questioner and read those out at the end on your behalf. So we're delighted to welcome Victoria Parkinson to lead the workshop today. Victoria is Library Solutions and Metadata Coordinator at King's College London, and has held that position for the last 6 years of her 10 years at KCL. Her role includes lots of cataloguing training, advocating for metadata with colleagues and managers, and dealing with large sets of bibliographic metadata, amongst many other things. So thank you so much, Victoria, and I will pass over to you now.
Thank you very much, Yamina, and thanks very much to Arlis for having me. I get to talk to you now about one of my favourite topics, which is cataloguing. I get very excited about this. This is going to be a, let me see if I can move my slides on. There we go. This is going to be quite a high level, brief look at a lot of different things that underlie our cataloguing. So I'm going to talk about some definitions so that we understand what I'm talking about as we go through. I'm going to look at some of our standards, including MARC and RDA, subject headings and classification, and then a little look to the future as well about what's going on at the moment and coming up soon. So first things first, what is metadata? So a classic definition of metadata is data that describes other data in a structured manner. And it can be, sorry, covering my screen. It could be manually or automatically created, and there can be metadata about the metadata. It can get very meta. So, for example, when we create a catalogue record for a book, it has information such as the title and author and publisher. And we'll also add information such as the language of the record. Are we cataloguing in English or French or German? And what standards being used so that everyone else knows how to interpret and look at the record. And there's also automatically generated metadata by the library management system, such as the date that the record was created. This isn't unique to libraries. For example, if you've ever taken a photo and maybe popped it on Flickr or photo sharing site, you'll know that as well as taking the actual photo, your camera often records data about metadata about where the picture was taken, if you've got GPS, the kind of lens used, other kind of photography related information, and that's encoded, the metadata is encoded in the photo. Metadata is often associated with computers, particularly in that term, but actually libraries have been creating and manipulating and standardizing metadata for over 100 years. As you can see, well over 100 years, in fact, as you can see from the picture of the Trinity College Library Catalogue from 1610 that I've got up there. And metadata isn't just about describing things, it brings context and meaning to what it's describing. It's not enough just to list details about something. And we do that when we do it in libraries. We've traditionally called it cataloguing and classification. So at its most basic, cataloguing is listing items with enough information to let someone differentiate between resources and choose the right one. So in fact, we actually all use catalogues all the time, even if you've never been to a library. It seems unlikely with the current audience, but even if you've never been to a library, you've used the ASOS or Amazon or Argos or Spotify. These are all catalogues. They're lists of items with enough information that let you identify and choose the shirt or the kettle or the track that you want. But it's not enough to just list the information, even with the full text search that we have access to nowadays. If that data doesn't have context and consistency, we can't really say it's usefully describing the object. And so our discovery solutions, the systems that are interacting with these catalogue records, need to be able to differentiate between the types of information in a record so that they can return relevant results. And one of the things we'll come to later is the library standards that we use that enable this in libraries. So this is a catalogue record from ASUS. It tells you about the items, it's got some of the features, it's got a unique identifier for it. It's got information about the composition and the physical characteristics and the brand that makes it and some keywords. And in brackets there on the right side, the labels, I've popped in what terms we might use. In when we talk about books. So we've got brand title, might be title author, physical characteristics, or we make a description of the resource, instructions for use. Well, when we catalogue something, we often say if you need a certain way to access it, like a DVD player, we'll make a note of that. And here is a catalogue record for a book containing the bibliographic details for fancy coffins. So depending on what's being catalogued, the catalogue record could also contain notes on previous owners and previous editions and languages, but this is a very simple record here. It's got the title, it's got who is responsible for the creation of it, the author, the publication details, the physical description, the series that it's part of, and it's got some subject headings. And now in green and yellow, these are access points, which I'll talk a bit more about later. So the other information is just taken straight from the book, and the information in green and yellow we've included according to specific guidelines to allow consistency. Okay, so that's cataloguing. Classification is where we group like items based on their subject matter. So this is a single point of access for the resource when we're talking about a physical book. And just as with cataloguing, classification needs consistency and uniformity so that we can make sure like resources are placed together. And it's the physical point of access for a book. So quick recap. Metadata is the data about an item, such as a book. I tend to use it as a catch-all for cataloguing classification. Cataloguing is where we list information about a book in a systematic way so that users can differentiate between the different versions and choose one. And classification is where we put all the like items together based on their subject matter, and we do this with class marks. Earlier, we saw part of the Trinity College Library Catalogue from 1610. Now, I'm not going to go quite as far back as that when I talk about the history of cataloguing, but I do want to mention some of the more recent history because it sets up where we are today. So in 1967, the UK, US and Canadian Library Associations got together and created the Anglo-American Cataloguing Rules, followed swiftly by the Anglo-American Cataloguing Rules, second edition, or AACR2 in 1978. Until relatively recently, this was the main cataloguing standard we used in libraries, so you may well have seen it or be familiar with it. Cataloguing rules lay out where information should come from and what information is required for physical descriptions of a resource, as well as the access points, which are the indexed fields of the catalogue record that users can search. So on that record, we looked at for fancy coffins, they were the yellow and green parts. So based on the card catalogue, an access point was any element of the record that resulted in a card being added to the catalogue for access. So access points or headings filed alphabetically in the catalogue. These are authors, titles and subject headings. And the access points are underpinned by authority records. So they contain information such as the preferred form of the name or the subject heading, alternative and previous preferred forms, and the source of the information, as well as sometimes other notes such as usage. The authority record for woodwork, for example, says that woodwork should be used rather than woodcraft or woodworking, and related terms include carpentry and fretwork. We're going to come back to authority records in a while. I love this picture from Ohio University, which is from, 1969, because we're supposed to be moving towards the future, and yet anytime any cataloguing gets done, it still looks remarkably like this piles and piles of books, despite being 50 years in the future. So this is an example of a catalogue card. So when AACR and AACR2 were created, they were used in conjunction with catalogue cards. And they bear the mark of its origins. So they obviously not a lot of room on a catalogue card. And so they used abbreviations wherever possible to accommodate the limited space. They used Latin terms because everyone knew them, they were in common usage. There were restrictions on the number of named authors you can have, and obviously originally at that time it was developed for books. They weren't cataloguing video cassettes or DVDs or ebooks or the kinds of things that we're adding to our catalogues nowadays. And here is the same record, but online. It's still in AACR2, but somehow it got from a catalogue card onto the computer, including, you'll see here in purple, the access points, so the authors' names and the subjects, which raises the question of how does the computer, it's one thing just to transcribe information onto a website, but how is the catalogue knowing that those are access points and that they can be searched and followed through? Well, computers are not that clever. Humans read a catalogue card and we understand what we're seeing, but computers need telling, and that's what MARC does. So MARC is the carrier standard. It's a machine readable cataloguing for the 21st century, MARC 21. And MARC's the carrier standard and provides the structure of the records, while RDA, resource description and access, which we'll come to shortly, decides what should go in each field. So to set the scene, this is what a computer looked like when MARC was developed. It's the Commodore PET from 1977. It came with 4 kilobytes of RAM, bless it. And at the time that MARC was developed in the 1960s and became an international standard in 1973, this was, computer space was at a premium, was designed for print material and to save its computer space wherever possible. So although it's been developed and expanded in the decades since, we'd probably describe it as adequate rather than perfect. Alongside that computer, to give people an idea of the kind of space costs that we're talking about there, now space is pretty much free. You get gigabytes and gigabytes for very low cost. The 8-inch floppy disks that are spread on that photo, in the late 1960s, they had 242 kilobytes. So you need over 4,000 of those to make a gigabyte. The 3.5-inch floppy on top there from the 1980s was 1.4 meg. So you need nearly 700 to make a gigabyte. So that's the kind of how tight and expensive space was then, that we weren't looking at gigabytes and gigabytes of space. MARC 21, so the machine readable cataloguing standard for the 21st century, came out in 1999, and that brought together US, UK and Canadian versions of MARC and became the standard that we're using today in most libraries. So this is what MARC 21 looks like. I like to show these records because I usually get a little panicked look from people who, when I'm training people cataloguing, because on the face of it, you can sort of make out words and see things, but also there's a lot of weird things going on in that record. So I wanted to demystify it slightly. Highlighted in grey there is the 3-digit number that is the field tag or name. So it's not human readable. I mean, you can read it 100 or a 245, but it doesn't really tell you what those are. So it's not human readable, but it is very space saving. So for example, what we're seeing here, the 245, I should have a little laser pointer. The 245 has got the title information, and the 264 has got imprint information. The very brief nature of these field names or field tags is testament to the high cost of computer space when MARC was being developed. And so they weren't bothered about particularly making them human readable, they wanted to make them brief. Cataloguers do usually get familiar with the most used codes and what they mean because we just use them so much, but actually memorizing them isn't required. Library management systems usually have helpful memory joggers, or maybe don't make you interact with the MARC at all. Incidentally, as we go forward, I often talk about MARC records, catalogue records, and bibliographic records interchangeably. For our purposes here, they're the same thing. They're not actually the same thing necessarily, but the differences are minute. So following those field codes are 1 or 2 numbers or blanks. Their slash indicates a blank. These are called indicators, and they help to further define the field. So they're 2 separate numbers that mean different things for each field. And they tell library management systems and discovery layers how to link or index or display the fields. Again, taking computers by the hand and walking them through it step by step, very slowly. For example, they might tell the system to ignore article words such as the or a or an when it's trying to put titles in alphabetical order, and does this by counting the number of characters to ignore. or with the imprint information in the 264 field, it may refer to the publisher, printer, or manufacturer. And the second indicator there, so there's a slash and then a 1. That second indicator is set to show that it's publisher information in this particular record. And then in the subject headings, the second indicator being 0. So down here we've got 650 means the subject heading, topical. The second indicator being a 0 here is telling the computer and the cataloguer that the vocabulary being used for subject headings is Library of Congress subject headings as opposed to one of the other vocabularies. Not all fields use indicators. You can see here double slashes in some of them, or they may only need one indicator or the other. And again, very brief, but they contain a lot of information behind the scenes, helping make them, again, these are not designed for us, they're designed for computers. So they know, and they are taught how to understand the rules and then therefore take a great deal of information from just a few characters. Space saving. Final bit of the MARC record I want to point out is the single characters in red, which are the subfields. So the 245 is the field itself, and within it, it's got some subfields, subdividing the information. So each field has one or more of these, and they separate different pieces of data out. The $sign here is just used to delimit the subfield and separate them out. Let's have a look. Sorry. Let's have a look in more detail. So I've got two title fields here, two 245 fields. Firstly, we've separated out the subfields. So subfield A has the main title, subfield B has the subtitle if it has one, subfield C has the author name. The Book of Marmalade has got a subtitle that's collected in subfield B. How to Raise Your IQ by Eating Gifted Children doesn't have a subtitle, therefore it doesn't have subfield B. And I mentioned that the indicator can help eliminate or help omit the articles from a title, and that's what we're seeing here. So this second indicator, being a 4 here, tells the system to count 4 characters from the beginning and then start alphabetizing. So ignore T, H, E, and the space, and start alphabetizing at B. Helps us help stop the index from having everything at either A or T. Obviously, tend to congregate according to the articles. How to Raise Your IQ by Eating Gifted Children has a 0 because we start out, the system can start alphabetizing directly at the H. At the top of the MARC record were some horrific looking strings of characters. So most of a MARC record, I would say, is readable even if you don't know exactly what you're looking for. You can probably take a good guess at which fields have got the title or the authors or the publication date, etc. But at the top of the MARC record, these we've got these essentially incomprehensible fields. They're coded by the cataloguer, but they're not written for humans. Even more than the rest of the MARC record, they're not for us. Rather, they are shortcuts that allow the system to index the records easily. So they contain things like the publication date of the resource, the main language where it's published, and a number of single characters that represent various properties, whether it's got an index or illustrations or has biographical material, and slashes, again, represent blanks. This is a screenshot from the library management system. Sorry, it's a screenshot from a system expanding on the 008 field. So you can see that although we do fill the data in, we're not actually counting along characters and going, right, the 5th character needs to be this. We put it into a much more friendly form, and the system pops it into that horrific looking string. So just popping back briefly. So you can see the strings appearing here. So even though we can make a good guess at the rest of the record, you could probably tell that that's, pages and illustrations. That's a physical description of the book. We've got up here, we've got all this stuff that's meant for computers, that's not for our eyes. So MARC is the carrier standard, but RDA, resource description and access, is what decides what goes into the record, from where and how it should look. So from now on, you won't see any more MARC because I think it is confusing and detracts from the rest of the record. So I've translated everything into human readable format for the rest of the records. But if you do want to see MARC records, if you're ever looking at a catalogue and you're interested to see what it looks like behind the scenes, many catalogues will have an option for you to look at the MARC. So in certainly the British Library and the Library of Congress catalogue, they do have an option where you're looking in there at the search results to see the MARC record that underlays the slightly more human readable form that you see. So lots of MARC records if you want to look at them. So earlier I talked about AACR2, Anglo-American Cataloguing Rules, released in second edition, released in 1978. RDA, the Resource Description and Access, came in 2010. So RDA and AACR2 are cataloguing standards. They're defining where the information about the resource should come from and how it should look, whether it needs to be transcribed from the book, from the resource, or whether it needs to be transformed in some way to standardize it. RDA is a cataloguing standard for the new world. So where librarians might be cataloguing ebooks, streaming films, model brains, and that, or therapy dogs, as well as the more mundane print books and DVDs. RDA is designed to handle all of these and more. It can accommodate an international audience, so no more Latin terms, to take advantage of the cheapness of computer space, so no more abbreviations, because we're no longer trying to squeeze everything onto a tiny catalogue card or a still fairly tiny electronic record with spaces almost free. And it's also designed to be linked data compatible, and it brings a new emphasis on relationships between entities, which offers quite exciting possibilities for the future. Theoretically, it can be used by more than just libraries because it isn't tied to a particular format. At the moment, I'm not aware of anything that isn't a library using it, but they might be out there. So linked data compatible means that RDA allows the data to be structured and constructed in such a way that it can be used easily with other data sets that have also been designed to be linked data compatible. To the naked eye, the two standards, AACR2 and RDA, look pretty similar, especially if they're both encoded using MARC 21, as they will be at many places, but they have some philosophical differences behind them that mean that you can't just convert directly from one to the other. So like AACR2, RDA instructs cataloguers on what information should be included in each field, where it should come from and how it should be written. For example, where's the best place to take the title from when it's written several times on a book? Does the record need to contain more than one title if it differs slightly? Or author, how many authors can we put in there? What to use if the publication data isn't obvious? Many catalogues in many libraries, even where we've moved towards using RDA, will still contain AACR2 records. There'll be hybrid catalogues containing both kinds of records. As well as being an exciting new standard for cataloguing, and it is bringing things a lot more up to date and much more natively able to deal with the kinds of things that we're cataloguing nowadays. RDA has also changed to how cataloguing standards work. So with AACR2, you could buy a printed book of the standard and you refer to that. Probably your cataloguing department made little notes when they had to interpret the rules, and passed it around the department and onto the new cataloguers, and it continued that way. With RDA, there isn't a printed version. Instead, libraries subscribe to the RDA toolkit for a certain number of concurrent users. This means that everyone is always seeing the most up-to-date version of the standard. But also, as the next version is published, it will be harder to stay with old versions because the rules just won't be available. The toolkit will update. And so with a yearly cost to consider, some libraries are going to be sticking with older standards such as AACR2 because they can't necessarily commit to a yearly cost to subscribe. This isn't necessarily bad or good, just quite different, very, I think, emblematic of the way things outside libraries or other things in libraries are being done at the moment, subscription rather than ownership for a lot of resources. But it creates a landscape where even more than the past, maybe we're seeing people using lots of different standards, lots of different queries, and that data still needing to be able to be interoperable at some level. So RDA lays out the main types of resources and the requirements for both describing a resource and laying clear its relationship to other resources. In a nutshell, that's what it's doing. So I've just popped the AACR2 record and RDA record for fancy coffins here side by side. They do look very similar because for simple records, they are very similar. But RDA, you can see, is emphasising the relationship of Dale Power to the work, that he's the author of it. AACR2 had the capability of this, but RDA places much more emphasis on it. We can also see that the abbreviations have been written out in full, which makes it much more accessible to people for whom perhaps English isn't the native language, or when you're trying to read a record that's been catalogued in a different language. So I did say no more MARC, tiny bit more MARC, but you don't have to worry about it. This is what RDA and MARC look like together. So RDA says that the information for filling in the title field should ideally come from the title page, and it says it should be transcribed as it appears there. It also says the capitalization and punctuation is not transcribed. So despite dental practice being capitalized here, it's not in the record. The punctuation in cataloguing is actually specified by a third standard, the ISBD, the International Standard for Bibliographic Description, but we don't look at that separately, and I'm not going to be covering it here. Don't worry about it. But it is responsible for the funny looking punctuation that you get in a record. RDA also says that the statement of responsibility must be recorded. This is a statement associated with the title proper of a resource that relates to the identification and or function of any agents responsible for the creation of or contributing to the realization of the intellectual or artistic content of the resource. And that is a very specific and detailed statement that is quite perhaps difficult to interpret at face value, and that is why in-house my instructions certainly tend to be written in a slightly more friendly format. But essentially it's saying that you need to say who made or created or is responsible for the creation or contributed to the creation of the book or resource that you're cataloguing. RDA lets the cataloguer decide whether they want to include information such as job title and honours. So in this record, it has been added in. It isn't always, it's up to the cataloguer. It's one small example of cataloguer's judgment, which makes up a large part of cataloguing. The rules are huge and vast, there's lots of them, but they still cannot encompass every possible situation. And therefore, as you catalogue, a lot of cataloguer's judgment where you interpret the rules, decide what's best based on in-house practice, your user base, your understanding of who's going to be looking at your records, and you apply your judgment. So that's the RDA side in the green. In the yellow is MARC, and that is saying that the title field is a 245 field. The main title goes in a subfield A, remainder in subfield B if it has one, and then the statement of responsibility goes in subfield C. MARC also says there can only be one 245 field, and within that field you can only have one subfield A, B and C. They can't be repeated. So that's them working hand in hand. Now, I'm going to dip very briefly into the theory of RDA. I usually tell people when I'm training them they don't have to worry about it too much, but understanding where something comes from gives you a really good handle on how to apply it and understand what kind of rules that you'll be seeing. So this is where all those acronyms, you thought the acronyms were bad before, this is where more acronyms come in. So RDA, Resource Description Access, the standard, is underpinned by the Functional Requirements of Bibliographic Records report from the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, IFLA, that came out in 1998. It's usually abbreviated to FRBR. It's actually a verb now. So the FRBR report underpins RDA. It was followed by the equally compelling Functional Requirements for Authority Data and the Functional Requirements of Subject to Authority Data in 2009-2010. FRBR, FRAD and FSAD are conceptual data models. They're separate from any cataloguing standard, and they emphasize the relationships between entities and user tasks. They say a lot of things in the FRBR report upon which RDA is based. The two things I want to mention briefly are that FRBR defines 4 user tasks, FISO, and WEMI, a hierarchical model of a bibliographic resource. FRBR, FRAD and FSAD were all developed separately over quite a period of time, as you can see from the dates there. In 2017, the library reference model was published by IFLA. This supersedes all 3 of them. And rather than covering those things separately, LRM is a model that consolidates those 3 models, making it more up-to-date and streamlined. It brings a 5th user task to the model, which we'll talk about, and it also brings a new RDA. So RDA was based on FRBR and the other 2, and now that the library reference model has updated or superseded with an updated bibliographic model, RDA has been updated as well to encompass those. So we're going to look very briefly at WEMI and FISO, but I do think it's useful to see them. This is WEMI. It's the hierarchical model of a bibliographic resource. It's the work, an expression, manifestation, and item. Now, this is the traditional diagram for it. So we have a work, it's a distinct intellectual or artistic creation. It's realized through an expression, which is the specific intellectual or artistic form that the work takes each time it's realized. That expression is embodied in the manifestation, which is the physical embodiment of an expression of work. and the manifestation itself is exemplified by an item, a single exemplar of a manifestation, a concrete entity. This is a very good diagram, but I usually use this one, which brings a bit more emphasis on an example. So here we have the work, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It's the distinct intellectual, it's artistic creation. It's the general idea of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It's not the written down version, it's just the concept of it. That's realised through the expression, perhaps the expression of Pride and Prejudice, the original text, or perhaps it's realised through the German translation of Pride and Prejudice. They're both expressions realising the work of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. In turn, those expressions are embodied in manifestations. So the version published by Wordsworth Classics of the original text of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice is one manifestation. The version published by Penguin is another manifestation. They're both manifestations embodying the expression of Pride and Prejudice, the original text, which in turn is realising Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Likewise, the two different German publications are two further manifestations of embodying the German translation of that's realising the work of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. The more I say these words, the less meaning they appear to have, but I think that's just overuse. At the bottom there, we've got the actual copies exemplifying the manifestations. So right on the left-hand side there, we've got the first one copy exemplifying the manifestation published by Wordsworth Classic that embodies the original text of Pride and Prejudice, that realises Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, the work. I usually say that manifestation is roughly ISBN level. If you think about if it's got a different ISBN, it's probably a different manifestation to another version of it. The copies themselves are the only physical real things in the entire pyramid, and they're what we stick in the library barcodes in. So if you've got two copies with two different barcodes in, they're both items of the same manifestation of the expression of the work. So an RDA record contains data from all of these levels, both from the work, expression and manifestation levels. But when it's realised in a MARC record, it's still a flat record just containing all of that information. So that was WEMI. If you ever look at the RDA guidelines in the toolkit, you'll see that it does refer to things like expression and manifestation level, and that's why knowing a little bit about what's under it can help you interpret the rules. I also said that the library reference model, and before that further, defines some user tasks. So it defines 5 user tasks. It says that when a user is looking for something, they want to find it, to bring together information about one or more resources of interest, to identify it so that they can distinguish between similar resources, to select it so that they can decide what's suitable and either reject it or accept it, to obtain it, actually get their little hands on it, and to explore it. This is the element that the new library reference model adds to the previous 4 tasks that were identified in the FRBR report, and that's to discover resources by using the relationships between them and therefore placing resources in a context. So this is the library reference model bringing together some of the missing gaps in the theory from the FRBR. The reason that I think these are key is that when we're cataloguing, it's not just about having a pretty record. It can seem that way, particularly when I did my MA and did a cat and class module a number of years ago now, like 15 years ago. There were lots of cataloguing rules. We talked about those and how to interpret and apply them, but we didn't really talk about the user. And actually, when we're cataloguing, our user is key. What our users want to do and enabling them to do that with our information is why we're bothering to catalogue. It doesn't matter how pretty the record looks if it isn't fit for helping our users fulfill their purposes. So bearing in mind that our users are trying to find, identify, select, obtain and explore is really important. And the new version of RDA, which was released last month in the RDA toolkit, is just another step on the journey for us realising that in our standards. So MARC 21 is working in partnership with RDA and AACR2. So MARC 21 is telling the systems what they're looking at and how to deal with it. And RDA and AACR2 say where the information should come and how it should look. But cataloguing is not just descriptive, where we copy information from the book and organise it. We also add subject headings, which are extra access points that users can find, identify, select, obtain and explore the collections. They talk about what the work is about, not what it is, and we use a controlled vocabulary for this for consistency. And we'll have a look at why. So an example of classification without, subject cataloguing without a controlled vocabulary is Flickr. So users can tag their photos with any terms that they choose with no control for ambiguity between identical tags that might refer to different concepts. For example, I had a quick search for nails and I found certain pictures of hardware and pictures of fingernails, as you might expect. I also found a picture of a bridge. There might be nails involved in the construction, but I'm not sure that's a key thing. But you can see here that the reason it's showing it's the bridge in Newcastle upon Tyne, which is where Jimmy Nail is from, and it's been tagged with some famous people from Newcastle upon Tyne as well, which is why that's appeared. So none of these pictures feature nails as the main component or the focus of the photo, but they're in the first results shown in the search. And looking at the tags does provide some surprising results of what people have considered important to tag. This is a pretty simplistic example. And in fact, if you were cataloguing photos in a library or archival context, you might still include what might be considered relatively minor elements so that users can search. But it highlights some of the questions that arise when we're classifying resources. So we've got to anticipate user needs, the bias and preconceptions of the cataloguer and the vocabulary being used, and consistency across cataloguers and institutions. So there's no potential for disambiguation between fingernails, nails here, or Jimmy Nail. Of course, using a controlled vocabulary brings its own restrictions, which we'll have a look at in a moment. But first, this is an uncontrolled classification example. Here is a controlled one. These are some library tags or subject headings. These ones are Library of Congress subject headings. Other vocabularies are available. So subject headings are a controlled vocabulary or thesaurus that allow catalogers to describe what a resource is about, hopefully in a consistent way. So they allow a topic to be described in a single term, not a single word, but a single term, and for works on the same topic to be listed together under the same terms. So subject headings cover topics, people, places, and time periods. So the Library of Congress subject headings that I've used here, that's a list of over 270,000 headings plus further subdivisions. Other vocabularies that you may well see are, for example, FAST, which is faceted subject terminology, which is based on Library of Congress, but slightly simplified and easier to apply, or MESH, medical subject headings, which is a vocabulary that is aimed specifically or covers specifically medical topics. Generally, when we're applying subject headings, they cover at least 20% of the subject of the book, and they don't describe what it is, but what it's about, and they use the narrowest possible term available. It's usual for resources to have more than one subject heading, so between about 3 and 5 is a good rule of thumb, unless something is perfectly described in one. And before I mentioned about authority records underlying things, so the reason we're using shopping carts here as the Library of Congress subject heading is that in the authority record for that heading, it says use shopping carts for shopping trolleys, which is perhaps a more British English term. So here is an example of an authority record underpinning the Library of Congress subject heading Apatosaurus. Authority records contain the official terms for subjects, plus see also terms and related or obsolete terms, and sometimes some scope notes giving more detail about what a heading could be used for. For example, searching for the heading for Brontosaurus brings up the heading for Apatosaurus because Brontosaurus is given as a variant heading that's not to be used. It also points to the broader term of Diplodocidae. In doing this, authority records provide authority control. That means establishing a recognised form for an entity name and using that form whenever the name is needed as an access point in a bibliographic record. They contain information such as the preferred form of a name, alternative and previous preferred forms, pseudonyms, and the source of information. And the authority records are for topical subjects, but also people, places, organisations. All of these access points that have a relationship with the book, there's that relationship word again, and need to be entered in a consistent manner. So authority records are allowing this to happen. Anytime, any field that we index, we want it to be controlled because we don't want the same person appearing in the list 5 times in slightly different ways. How would anyone find all the resources associated with that person or that subject if that was the case? I really like this quote from Liz Antal because subject headings are a way that we speak to our users. Unlike descriptive cataloguing, which is what a lot of the record is, we're spending a lot of time just transcribing information from the resource itself. when we apply subject headings, a cataloger is choosing those with care. There's no default option to just apply them. And so it is how we're having a conversation with our users when we add subject headings, and come back to why that's important. Classification. So classification schemes such as Dewey and Library of Congress classification and Universal Decimal classification and Bliss and others. This is where we assign a class mark to an item so that we can shelve it with like items, as I defined in classification earlier. So probably the most well-known classification schemes tend to be Library of Congress and Dewey. There are many others on slightly smaller scales. As mentioned, UDC, Universal Decimal Classification, Bliss, National Library of Medicine, which is a medical-based one. Like Library of Congress subject headings, Library of Congress classification originates from classifying the literal Library of Congress. It carries the same biases and the same restrictions. So neither of these systems are an attempt to classify or describe all knowledge. They're literally trying to describe what the Library of Congress has in it. It's just such a large library that it actually covers most things, but not everything. So classification schemes are attempting to divide up and group everything, to arrange all knowledge in groups and hierarchies. And I think when you put it like that, it sounds pretty impossible. Different classification schemes take different approaches, and there's not really a single perfect way. On the screen here, I've just listed out the segments of the Dewey Decimal classification and the Library of Congress classification. You can see slightly different decisions being taken for what goes where, what goes next to each other. You can also see some of the biases inherent in this. So I've just pulled out religion, where Christianity gets a huge amount of the 200s, and in Dewey and other religions are relegated to a fairly small amount. You can see the same thing here. I assure you the Library of Congress is no better, but it's probably most obvious here, where history of the world is in D, but history of America, just America gets the whole thing, plus the history of the Americas gets one other whole letter to itself. It's understandable because it is from the Library of Congress. It is originally classifying a collection in America, but it brings up problems or things to consider when we apply these classification schemes to other collections in other countries, where maybe we're a little less interested in holding lots of books about the history of America and a bit more interested about holding books on the history of our own countries or other matters. So I heard a talk by Barbara Kwasnick last night. He said that Dewey and Library of Congress are actually both, there's several different classification schemes wrapped up under one name because they were developed by different people. Parts of them were developed by different people at different times, and that's something worth keeping in mind as we use and deploy them. So Dewey was published in 1876 and Library of Congress in 1897. It's a very long time ago. And the other schemes I've mentioned, UDC 1895, Bliss 1940, that they all are quite old and bear some of their origins. The time that they were created and put together is certainly present in them still today. However, although they are huge and slow to change, they are all living standards. They're continually updated. For the Library of Congress, there are processes to make recommendations for changes to subject headings, and many librarians around the world are doing their best to improve these standards as we go. So another quote is one from Melissa McCulloch, which I really like, which talks about the power in cataloguing, and the idea of cataloguing being or having power is something we're going to come to in a moment. First, I want to talk about briefly about why it's so important. So probably we're all on the same page because you've listened to me talk about this for quite some time now, but the reason it is so important that we have good records, that we spend our time creating them and classifying our resources is, well, first off, it comes down to money. If we buy a book and no one can find it, it is an absolute waste of money. Not being able to find a book is the same as not having it, but slightly more frustrating. This goes double for electronic resources, which you can't even hope to trip over on a bookshelf. Metadata is what makes our resources discoverable and therefore usable, and good quality metadata makes the money spent on the resources worth it. Enriched records that have subject headings and contents pages can enhance discovery beyond the title page, but with more precision than a full text search. Another reason why it's so important is that we can't trust our statistics if we aren't sure that users know what we have. So we rely more and more on having access, knowing what we've got, and having accurate usage data to make stock and collection decisions in many libraries. And that starts with being able to be sure that our users can find the book if they want it. And also lots of changes happening, some of which I'll be talking about near the end, and future moves to new standards or new systems. Without good quality standards compliant data, they will be really painful, because data migration and data acting on data relies on having consistency in our records. So it's really important. I mentioned that keyword quality. So I think sometimes the assumption is that it's better to have a poor quality record than none at all. But I actually don't think that's correct. I think a poor quality record can mislead users and staff about our stock. It causes frustration and a poor experience, and it contributes to unreliable statistics where we might think no one wants this book because they haven't bothered to use it for 5 years. But in actuality, they didn't know it was there because they couldn't find it. It was, not just misshelved, but it, a typo or some data that was incorrect meant no one's ever come across the book. Depending on the priorities of your library, if you work in one, then you or your colleagues likely spend hours deciding on what to buy to suit your users' needs, more time on purchasing and acquiring that material, processing it, managing it, reading it when necessary. And all of that work is futile unless the resources make it to the users. And collection, development and management often use statistics, as I said. And so users vote with their library cards to tell us what's useful, what they want more of, and what isn't any use to them. And we trust when we see a book hasn't been borrowed, it's because it isn't what they need. And so we need to make a new decision about collection, management, development. Perhaps it's been superseded by a new edition, or there's a better written book, or the information is outdated now. But if the book just can't be found, well, there's suppositions in the mood. So I've put 5 things that when I present to my manager at work, what I talk about when I define quality is that it conforms to standards, increases discoverability, is timely, puts users first, and works with our systems. It's really hard to define quality, a good quality record, because it varies by what library, your audience, your purpose. And there's an old, possibly apocryphal definition of trying to classify pornography, and it's like, I know it when I see it, which is probably the same with a good quality catalogue record. This is actually a slide I used when I presented to some senior managers at work a few months ago to talk about and advocate for good quality metadata. And then I read an article by Arlis McCulloch about what she considers quality to be, and it redefined again what I thought quality should be. So she defined it as informative, accessible, respectful, accurate, and empowering. And these are now some extra properties that I'll be adding to the next time I talk to people about what quality metadata is, because they're right. She's right. It isn't just about whether something like meets these standards, but and it's about our users and the conversation that we're having with them. And it's something that, we should hope that our catalogues are empowering and respectful as well as informative and accurate. So I talked a little bit about the future. So things coming up at the moment in the world of cataloguing, it's possibly more fast moving now than it has been previous decades, let's say, although I think change has always been happening. It's perhaps just more obvious now, the more interconnected that we become. So one thing that's coming is, I've talked about AACR and AACR2, how they went from being on a card catalogue to online using MARC 21, how AACR2 has been superseded to some extent, although it's still around and usable, by RDA. But RDA is still being encoded in MARC 21. It's MARC 21's time for a new standard to come, and that standard is the bibliographic framework. So BIBFRAME is linked data compatible again. So along with RDA, it is also it's also working to make the data compatible with other data sets from outside of the library world. BIBFRAME was originally published in 2012. BIBFRAME 2.0 came in 2016. MARC is fairly old in the world of computers. If you think back to the 70s, we've come a long way. Most of the technology and standards at its creation have been superseded, and its death has actually been predicted for quite a long time, and it's still around and doing its little best. But its successor, BIBFRAME, is a new metadata carrier format designed to be suited for the 21st century. The metaphor of silos of data is a bit overused, and libraries, we do share our metadata and have through various systems for years and years, but it never really gets outside libraries, and so no one reuses it. So BIBFRAME developed in 2012. The hope with this being linked data compatible is that we can bust out of our silos, we can bring in data from outside, we can share our massive collections of metadata with the world outside libraries. So I did mention that it was, we've had the second version since 2016, but so far uptake has been quite limited. There's lots of reasons for this, systems and training and cost of change. So it's still sort of chugging away. For many libraries, I think it's going to rely on the bigger libraries taking it up first, and all of our systems and vendors being in place to enable it, and that's getting there. But the amount of training and the cost of the change, you know, these things are going to come slowly, particularly when MARC 21, while not perfect, it's still, you know, doing its job pretty well. For those who are curious, on the screen at the moment is a sample of BIBFRAME, so you can see the author and title of the book there, here, and title here. It looks just like an XML document if you're familiar with XML. So does BIBFRAME mean that RDA will change again? No, because RDA wasn't designed to be used specifically with MARC. It can be carried by many standards. It could be carried by XML or Dublin Core. And in the same way, BIBFRAME doesn't have to carry RDA. It could carry AACR2, although it seems unlikely, but it could carry other metadata schemas as well. The two standards, like MARC and RDA, are going to work quite closely together, but they're not wedded to each other. They can see other standards. It's very modern. So coming to my last few slides, I haven't remotely got time to do justice to the topic of critical cataloguing, but I do think it's important to raise it. When I did my Cat and Class module 12 or 13 years ago, it wasn't really mentioned, but more and more work is being done to address the problems and biases that are embedded in our cataloguing systems. So cataloguing isn't neutral. Earlier I showed a quote that said cataloguing is power. And this brings with it the responsibility to be aware of the power that we're wielding when we choose words to classify resources and where we put them. There have been people questioning and looking critically at our classification schemas for a long time now. But in the last few years, this has really increased. And of course, with the Black Lives Matter movement coming back to prominence over this past year, there's a greater appetite to have these conversations at high levels, or that's been my experience, certainly. So to mention just a few areas, and again, you know, a very, very brief look at what is a huge topic. Trans authors of zines, problematic and outdated terminology used in subject headings, such as illegal aliens. There's been a push to move that to undocumented immigrants, categorizing indigenous religions as mythology, while still holding, say, Christianity as a religion. And who is deciding what the preferred terms are when we're using subject headings? So I talk mostly about Library of Congress classification subject headings because those are the ones I use every day and they're the ones I'm most familiar with. And they are definitely Anglo-American, white and Christian-centric. So that's something we have to bear in mind when we apply them and to look critically at them as we use them and interact with them. But the developments in critical and radical cataloguing are some of the things I'm most excited about for our future in metadata. I have a very quick slide that just illustrates one thing around one particular Library of Congress subject heading. So as I mentioned, it's a huge vocabulary of 270,000 terms. That's a lot to try and keep up with modern usage, and they do their best, but they do sometimes have outdated terminology, and the difference between, say, British English and American English can also exacerbate some of the terms. But the Anglo-American white straight male default is something that comes up a number of times in Library of Congress. So for example, we've got the Library of Congress subject heading librarians. You can also have gay librarians, lesbian librarians, African American librarians, women librarians, minority women librarians, transsexual librarians, and transgender librarians. But you could be forgiven for assuming from the subject headings available to us that there are just no male librarians. And actually, of course, if it was a book about male librarians, it would end up in just under librarians. Partly this is because the Library of Congress, as I've mentioned, is a working library. It creates headings for their actual holdings rather than an all-encompassing thesaurus. It reflects the published works that the library contains. But it is something to be aware of when we're applying these and the message that we're sending out to people, to our users, the conversation that we're starting with them. I really recommend the Changing the Subject documentary, which is now on YouTube, which talks about the effort to change from illegal aliens to undocumented immigrants in the Library of Congress subject headings. And there's hope that in the near future, with the change of the US government, that fight could continue and finally succeed. It's about an hour and it's really good. So because of its breadth and depth, Library of Congress subject headings are difficult to replace, and so we and many other libraries continue to use it. There's lots of librarians making efforts to improve it, as I said, lots of ways to do this, and some libraries have chosen to supplement using Library of Congress subject headings with other more specialised vocabularies, or to use other subject headings instead. So one example of this is in Australia and New Zealand, the Schools Catalogue Information Service posted last year about work they've done to recognise the Maori and Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures in their database. There aren't many specific headings in the Library of Congress for those peoples, and so they've created a separate, more nuanced vocabulary that can also be applied so that they're properly represented. Oh, I meant to say, of course, even if you're not cataloguing, even if all you're doing is working in the library or just interacting as a user with the catalogue, being critical about the systems they're using is something that anyone can do. Go back all the way through that slide again. But QuickCat is a hashtag on Twitter that will be like a gateway to loads of resources, information, and critical cataloguing, radical cataloguing. If it's something you're interested in finding more about, those are two good key terms to start looking for it. But it's really worth it for all of us to think about these things as we use them. Okay. There are some national level projects happening in the UK as well. Some of these are slightly academic library focused because that's where my attention is, working in academic library. But we have Plan M, which is a bibliographic metadata supply model, taking a look at the records. Many of us buy them in from vendors, so it's taking a look at how that happens and ways to improve it. The MBK provides a replacement. The JISC Library Hub replaces the COPAC Union Catalogue for research libraries across the UK. They also developing a quality tool and allowing us to compare records, which lets us do collaborative collection management and development work across institutions. The UKRRM has noted that there are significant issues with data quality, and they're working to look at how they can apply some of the lessons from UKRR, which was serials focused, to monographs. And the JISC Library Hub Community Advisory Board is looking at retention intention. So again, allowing for collection management and weeding decisions across institutions rather than each of us working on our own little projects. So these are all coming up and really exciting for me anyway. I'm a metadata nerd. I think these slides are going to be can be shared later. So there's a very brief bibliography for more resources. And if you wanted to have a go at cataloguing and you aren't a cataloguer yourself, there is a cataloguing choose your own adventure game at this address, so you can have a go at it. You don't need to know anything about cataloguing. It will talk you through various bits of it, and it takes maybe about 25 minutes to have a go at. So that is quite a fast, and there's a lot I've covered, but I think I've said all I have to say. I'm happy to take questions, and I think Yamina's going to sort those out. Thank you very much.